Just going to run this dog to see if we can find any type of human remains that are left.
Listen to Where Secrets Go to Die, The Disappearance of Derek Hennigan. From the Detroit Free Press, a new podcast set in the woods of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Available on Apple, Spotify, Freep.com, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Now, the BuckeyeXtra podcast with Rob Aller, Bill Rabinowitz, and Joey Kaufman from the Columbus Dispatch.
Hello, listeners. Welcome back to the BuckeyeXtra football podcast, a two-man edition of our Ohio State football podcast. I'm Joey Kaufman, joined by Bill Rabinowitz. May is a slow time on the college football calendar. Nonetheless, we got a few updates with some transfers who have joined Ohio State. And also, Bill, you wrote a profile, and that's more of a feature, I guess, on Gene Smith, who is retiring as Ohio State's athletic director next month. So you spent a lot of time talking to Gene at the spring game and talking to other folks who have worked with Gene about his career. So if folks haven't read that, they should. It's up on our website, and maybe we can attach it to the show notes. But let's maybe talk about some of your main takeaways from that piece, Bill.
Yeah, this was an assignment that, well, when Gene announced his retirement last August, we both said, when the time comes, let's do kind of a big retrospective on his career, his impact, his legacy, all that stuff. And so that's what we did. I talked to him. I talked to him for like more than an hour before the spring game. I talked to a bunch of ADs. I talked to Jim Delaney. I talked to Michael Drake, which was the surprise. I was shocked that he would talk to me. And then I was shocked. I don't know if people read the story. Hopefully they did. Ran a couple weeks ago with Michael Drake talking really for the first time ever about his thoughts on what happened in 2018 with the Genes or the Urban Meyer and Zach Smith, and to a degree, Gene Smith stuff. Gene got suspended for that, for his response or lack thereof to the Zach Smith. I don't know if you call it a scandal. I don't know what you call it. Whatever that was. And
Saga episode?
Saga. I usually call it saga. Saga is kind of a nice catch-all word. Anything's a saga. Any pair with teenagers.
August 2018 to you probably felt like saga.
That was awful. So anyway, Gene Smith is among the very most influential athletic directors of all time. I don't think there's really much of a question. Jim Delaney, in fact, a longtime Big Ten athletic commissioner, said he absolutely belongs on the Mountain Rushmore, so to speak, of college athletic directors. Some of it is because he was the AD at Ohio State, 19 years, guided the Buckeyes through tumultuous times, good and bad. Part of it is the fact that he was not the first Black athletic director, but he was probably the most impactful one. And his legacy includes the first Asian American athletic director, first Asian American athletic director at a Power 5 school, several women ADs, Black ADs. I mean, Martin Jarmond at UCLA is one of his proteges. Diana Sabo at Utah State, formerly of the Big Ten. Pat Chun is the one who's now at Washington, was at Washington State. Ben Jay was at Hawaii. Heather Lyke at Pitt. So, and many, many others that maybe aren't ADs, but have gone on to other things. And the thing that Gene was most proud of when I asked him about his greatest accomplishments or what he is most proud of, he said it was the academic improvement at Ohio State. And I don't have the stats in front of me, but it was something like when he got there, Ohio State had something like 300 and something scholar athletes. You have to have a 3.0 or better to qualify for that. And last year they had, or the last reporting period, they had something like 800 or 900 of them. And so, that is something. A lot of that is SASO, which is the academic arm that helps, the tutoring arm that really does help. But, you don't the thing about Ohio State as a university is it used to be a very easy place to get into. When I was growing up, Ohio State was everybody's safety school, and then they would weed you out when you got here. But it was very easy to get. Now it's very hard to get into, and you have to work to stay here and to graduate. And so it is a much better academic institution than it was. I'm not crediting Gene Smith for that. I'm just saying that's just the reality of what how Ohio State has progressed. But you do by and large have found Ohio State players. I'm speaking football because I've covered football. You don't have the issues. You don't have the knucklehead factor that maybe you did a generation ago. I didn't cover the team then, but it wasn't. I don't think I'm stepping out of bounds here to say that there were more problems there, more police blotter stuff than you have now. Now it's pretty rare. It still happens because you're still dealing with 18 to 22-year-old young men, but it's not happening with the prevalence that it used to. And so anyway, so that's, Gene was generous with his time. I talked to everybody. The one person I did not talk to that I thought I was going to talk to was his wife, Sheila. And she committed to talking and then decided she's a behind-the-scenes person, a very influential behind-the-scenes
I was going to say, she's pretty influential behind the scenes.
They are a team.
In your lead-in for the story, talking about how Gene didn't want to take the Ohio State AD job at first. He was content at Arizona State, and he turned him down at first, but at his wife's urging, he ended up going to the interview, and as they say, the rest is sort of history there.
Just going to run this dog to see if we can find any type of human remains that are left.
Listen to Where Secrets Go to Die, The Disappearance of Derek Hennigan. From the Detroit Free Press, a new podcast set in the woods of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Available on Apple, Spotify, Freep.com, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, I mean, they are a team. I kind of threw out the analogy of Bill and Hillary Clinton, and he didn't dismiss it. I mean, obviously, it's not the same, but it's that a little bit of that dynamic, and that Gene is the schmoozer, and he's the people person, and not that Sheila isn't, but Sheila can be blunt and cut to the chase and tell him what she thinks he needs to hear, and he respects her opinion very, very much. And so they are very much a team. It's never been just Gene Smith. It's always been Gene and Sheila. And in terms of hosting things, look, a lot of the job of an AD is to raise funds. And that requires having get-togethers at your house and entertaining and all that kind of stuff. And they did. I think a lot of that, I think the driver behind that was more Sheila in terms of organizing those kind of events. But, I thought it was interesting. I think Gene's biggest strength is his self-awareness. And that's not what I think. It's what other people told me, that he knows what he is and knows what he isn't. And he told me, I'm never the smartest guy in the room, but I can read a room. And I know how to mold people. I know how to read people. I know how to listen to people. And that's a really underrated skill. Anyone can talk, but can you listen? And can you get people from point A to point B when maybe they need some persuading to get from point A to point B? And he's very good at that. It's been a very influential career. He served on countless NCAA committees, and he was on the basketball selection committee. He was on the football CFP committee. He's going to leave quite an imprint.
Yeah, I think that's fair as far as his ability to read a room, certainly, and his ability to, I think, be congenial. I think is probably the word I would choose. And because I remember just last fall when Ohio State was playing at Notre Dame and reporting the story I did on his time as a Notre Dame assistant, he was a special teams coach, and that's such a position group where you're dealing with punters and kickers and return specialists and linemen. You're sort of a mismatch of guys, and he's a 20-something-year-old assistant doing it for the first time and dealing with different personalities. I think that shaped him, but he does, I think, as you say, that certainly, I think, set a foundation for him. But I think he just has sort of a natural way of interacting with people. I do want to ask you, Bill, about some of the obvious crossover storylines with football. And I think there are probably 3 or so big ones from his tenure as the Ohio State athletic director. I think you started with the tattoo gate and that scandal, the hiring of Urban Meyer, and the fallout from the Zach Smith scandal, but also getting a chance to sort of see Ryan Day audition for that job and take a gamble and promote a 40-year-old first-time head coach that Ohio State had not happened since what was it, I think the 1930s or 40s, somewhere in there. That hadn't happened in 3/4 of a century. He taps Ryan Day. Those are sort of, I think, the big mile markers from his tenure as the AD. What were some of your takeaways from what he had to say about those chapters?
Yeah, he was candid about them. He said that he knew that the Zach Smith thing, that as the head of the department, he was ultimately responsible. And so if that was not handled properly, he had to face the consequences. My sense of it is that he kind of took his medicine and moved on. I think it probably affected Urban Meyer a little bit more. And some of his Urban Meyer was really the focus of it, right? I mean, Gene was more collateral damage in a way. Urban was more the central figure in that. But, the tattoo gate thing, he really didn't have much of a choice. I mean, he didn't do anything wrong in that. The issue there was, first of all, those rules were so outdated. And, Gene, the thing that struck Gene about it, I think, is that he had pushed for a long time to have some version of NIL long before it was actually approved, 3 years ago. I mean, he pushed to give athletes more, whether it was cost of attendance, and that is essentially not just covering the tuition, room and board and books, but also living expenses. Just if you want to take your girlfriend to a movie, do you have the money to do it? And he fought for that for a long time. And I think what he believes, and I think he's right, is that because those players at that time didn't have access to that kind of money, they felt like the only way they could live a somewhat normal life was to accept the tattoos, the member, I'll do that because that was the way to make ends meet. And so I think he always felt like that was a silly scandal, especially in hindsight. But he also understood that the rules were what they were. And when Jim Tressel signed that NCAA form saying I didn't know anything, and it turns out he did, his hands were tied. There was really no decision to make unless you just want to flout NCAA rules. And he wasn't going to do that, and the school wasn't going to do that.
Nowadays you certainly might do that. It would be interesting that scandal had happened.
What are the rules?
Because you look at Tennessee, they were targeted by the NCAA over NIL rules violations. The state attorney general ended up suing the NCAA related to the rules enforcement. So the climate around things is different now than it was in the late aughts, because 15 years ago, because people were generally trying to comply more than NCAA rules then.
There were rules then, and you had to follow them however stupid you thought they were. And now there are no rules, and people are clamoring for rules so that it's not complete anarchy.
And the NCAA has suffered enough losses in court too, where maybe if you're an attorney general for a state, it's turf you can win on.
Yeah, it's low hanging fruit, and any day we're going to find out about the House. Apparently that's going to settle, and that's going to change the landscape of college sports. We don't really want to get into that too deeply, but basically it's going to be revenue sharing with athletes, and what form that takes, and to the extent how much they get, that's open to negotiation. But that's going to be the next domino to fall. In terms of Gene hiring Urban Meyer, look, that was pretty much a no-brainer. Urban Meyer happened to be available because he had left Florida. Ohio State struggled in 2011. Gene wasn't going to keep Luke Fickell as the coach, and Urban Meyer's. Everyone was speculating about that. But he still hired him and deserves credit for that, or blame if you're an anti-Urban Meyer guy, I guess. But look, the record that Urban Meyer had at Ohio State was pretty good. The only bit of a disappointment in terms of results was they only won one national championship, but certainly he raised the program to a different level. Hiring Ryan Day, that was a gutsy move, because there would have been any number of really, really good candidates with stronger resumes than Ryan Day. But I think what Gene Smith saw in Ryan Day was, first of all, Urban Meyer wanted Ryan Day to succeed him. I think that was influential. I think he was truly impressed by how Ryan Day handled the job when he was the acting coach during Urban's suspension. I think he saw that Ryan Day would be a nice kind of counter to Urban Meyer in style, where Urban Meyer, everything was 4th and 1. Everything every day was the Super Bowl, and it kind of wore people out. And not that Ryan Day is not hyper competitive, because he is, but he has much better people skills in terms of managing people, making them feel good about themselves and valued and all that stuff. Urban Meyer was kind of an old school Woody Hayes kind of guy in terms of how you treated your underlings. And I think it's been much more collaborative with Ryan Day. But, and Ryan Day obviously had the Michigan losing streak's an issue, and not being able to win it all is an issue. But other than that, and again, that's a pretty big other than that. Look, his record is phenomenal, and he's represented the university well. He's recruited very well. It does feel like a matter of time before he does break through. This year, obviously, is the one that they want to have that breakthrough, and might need to have that breakthrough. It's certainly got to beat Michigan, probably win the Big Ten, do well in the playoff. But anyway, I think at this point you could say that Gene Smith's hire of Ryan Day has been a successful one by and large.
Yeah, and I think even though he's retiring as the athletic director in June, to me, he feels committed to seeing it through in a way, and ultimately that decision will rest with Ross Bjork, who follows Gene. But you look at the last few months as the head of the Ohio State athletic department, Gene really signed off on a staff payroll for Ohio State's assistant coaches that was much higher than it typically is. And you look at what Ryan Day wanted to do and step away from being the primary play caller and be more of a CEO. Ultimately, that needs to be greenlit by the Fawcett Center and the powers that be to have the payroll to do that. And for only the second time, an FBS public school is going to have $2 million coordinators. And Jim Knowles was basically at that last year at 1.9 something million. Now he's over 2 million, and Chip Kelly's over 2 million, as Bill O'Brien would have been, which is the sort of in the ballpark of salary figures you would need to attract a coach of that stature and that profile, to one, to bring them to Columbus, and then two, that would have aligned with Ryan Day's vision of taking a step back a little bit from just the day-to-day grind of scripting an offensive game plan and having somebody he can trust. So that to me was, I think, Gene's leaving, but trying to put football, Isaac's football program on its best foot forward by signing off on that stuff. I think it was at a different press setting a few weeks back before that where Gene said he went berserk with football. I think that was the word he used in terms of the way he signed off on some of the salary increase. But it's a big payroll this year, the biggest they've ever had.
Yes. Yeah, some of that is because you're replacing Corey Dennis, who made pennies comparatively, with Chip Kelly and Bill O'Brien before that. And so that was going to be a sizable increase. But yeah,
probably the biggest change.
Yeah, but to your point, yes, Gene basically said, okay, I'm not going to stand in your way. I'll give you everything you want. and we're all in this year. We're not going to let money be a deterrent. And so it wasn't. And I think that even though Gene will be gone at the end of next month, he will consider the 2024 Ohio State football team to still kind of be his in terms of how they do. And is that still part of his legacy? I think he would say absolutely. And I think anyone would. I mean, it is. So he'll be gone, but his impact will not be. And so, yeah, it's been a remarkable career for him. I mean, he was at Ohio State for 19 years. He was at Eastern Michigan, Iowa State, and Arizona State before that. First of all, 19 years at a place like Ohio State is like dog years, right? I mean, the demands are so incredible. You have 36 sports. You have a football program that a fan base demands nothing but perfection. You have a men's basketball program that's had its peaks and valleys. They went to the championship game with Gene Smith as the AD under Thad Matta. And they've also, you could argue, well, I think it's pretty safe to say he missed on the Chris Holtmann hire. Chris Holtmann was a miss. He, had to fire him during the season because the team was tanking so badly. I mean, not if tanking is the right word, but they were awful. I mean, and then when he made the switch and Jake Diebler took over, they they played much better at the end of the year. So I think that was a miss. He's hired other terrific coaches. Nadine Muzerall, the women's hockey coach. Again, that was more Diana Sabo as the direct assistant AD who hired her, but Gene has to sign off on that. I mean, he hired some really good coaches, but there were other scandals too. The rowing coach, crew coach, there was a scandal there. Assistant women's basketball coach had to resign. That some of that is, look, when you've been somewhere 2 decades, that kind of stuff's going to happen. It's the NCAA rules are so kind of weird, and you're going to have issues. So it's not been perfect by any means, but I think it's pretty safe to say that Gene is highly respected around the country and certainly in the department. I mean, I remember doing a story a couple of years ago, maybe it's during that the suspension thing when he got suspended. And I had people, I don't know who directed that, I don't know what happened. I had like coaches call me unsolicited just to defend Gene. You always kind of question motives and why is this happening kind of thing. But the fact that they seemed to be very genuine in doing so was striking to me, because at a lot of places, and this is what Joshua Perry told me, the former Ohio State linebacker, a lot of places he's heard from his colleagues, former players, that the AD is a remote figure. It's kind of like nobody really interacts with him. He's intimidating, or she's intimidating to be around. And Gene was not like that at all. I mean, he was buddies with a lot of the players, and they really came to feel like he was their friend as well as kind of athletic director. And so that kind of goes back to Gene being a schmoozer and Gene being a people person. And, schmooze can kind of have a negative connotation. I think he's just a naturally gregarious person and likes meeting people, likes making people feel good. But he also was tough when he needed to be. People told me that behind the scenes, he would tell them, you got to do this and you got to be tough. Firing Chris Holtmann was a tough move. I mean, he likes Chris Holtmann a lot, but just it got to a point where he had to make a change. So anyway, I've known him longer than you have, Joey. I don't know what your impressions are of him.
A lot of what you said, I think, is accurate. I think overall his background, I think, was instrumental in sort of shaping who he was. I mean, he was a player. He was a football coach for a handful of years. He worked in the private sector, working in corporate America, worked for IBM,
right?
Did sales there. So and then started at Eastern Michigan as an assistant AD. So I think he just had a really good background where he had played high-level college sports, as an understanding of what it's like to coach, what it's like to play, and then a good background in sort of the number crunching that comes with being AD. Then you combine that with his personality. I think he just hit on a lot of the traits you need to be an athletic director, which has only grown as a more complicated job in the college sports industry. I mean, 50 years ago, what would happen is the football coach would get to retirement age and they would just sort of kick him upstairs, and the athletic department would sort of run a little more on autopilot. Now it's much more like a fundraising CEO type of job, where it's truly a big time executive, which was not the case when you were having just your former football coach run things. So that's a much different sort of job than it is now, even much different job than it was 20 years ago. Just thinking about some of the name, image, and likeness stuff, and balancing how do you direct donors to give to an NIL collective versus donors to give to the athletic department, which would fund coaching salaries and facilities upgrades and Olympic sports. So it's a much more of a balancing act and much more of especially a budget financing balancing act than it ever was in the past.
Yeah, no question about it. I think we've probably covered the Gene stuff. And as you said, Joey, this May and June and until really Big Ten Media Days, this is the downtime for college sports. If there ever is a downtime for college football, it's now. There'll still be commitments from recruits and things like that. But in terms of formal stuff, this is kind of where they go underground a little bit. But Ohio State did, let's kind of do a little sum up of the transfer portal and Ohio State did. And I think
the last update we gave on this podcast. So if you were downloading, listening to our last episode, was after the portal window had closed. Ohio State kept all 5 quarterbacks, which was a bit of I won't say shock, but certainly a bit surprising. You figure with all the talented arms in that room and the number of opportunities to line up behind center, you figure maybe one of them might leave or one of them might sniff out a better opportunity somewhere else. That didn't happen. Not shocking, but still surprising. And overall, they had 6 guys go into the portal, but they've now added some. So with all those players leaving, they have room to add. They've added 3 guys over the last couple of weeks. Just a quick rundown of who those are. 2 of them are set to be preferred walk-ons. One of them is Sean Lodge, who is a wide receiver from Presbyterian College. He's a native of Akron. Largely been a sort of I think where he could have the biggest impact might be as a return specialist. Help Ohio State on kickoff returns with Xavier Johnson leaving. And they also added a punter from Buffalo, Anthony Veneri, who will be in that competition to replace Jesse Mirko. And then last Friday, they had a transfer from South Carolina, a defensive back, Keenan Nelson Jr., who will help with some depth at secondary, especially at safety. He should be on scholarship, so they'll move Ohio State's scholarship count. The unofficial tally I have for them right now is at 81 scholarship guys. They could promote some walk-ons to scholarship status. They could still also look to go into the transfer portal and add a few more guys in there. But they added the top line guys in January. This is if they're going to add anybody, it's largely going to be try to add some depth, try to add some guys who may not have an immediate pathway to playing time this year. Certainly, maybe be of a longer term impact. So that's sort of where Ohio State stands right now in terms of managing their roster for this upcoming season.
And as we've talked about before, the big news in the transfer world is who Ohio State didn't lose. And who they picked up early. I mean, we all know what happened with the Caleb Downs and Will Howards and those guys. But after the spring, they didn't lose anybody of consequence. Anybody who was an impact player for them last year or figured to be a major impact player for them this year. Jahad Carter left, and he was hurt a lot of last year, the Syracuse transfer. And so there was a thought. I mean, he was truly competing for a starting job last summer. Didn't work out in part because of injuries, but I think he saw that there was no pathway for him to be a starter or even a significant backup, maybe. And so Ohio State didn't lose anybody that I don't think that they could stand to lose.
They essentially traded, in some ways, Jahad Carter for Keenan Nelson Jr. He was the player to be named later.
Right.
Great. And arguably maybe an upgrade only as so far as I can't say I've watched a ton of film cut-ups of Keenan Nelson Jr., but he has 3 years of eligibility left. Jahad Carter had 1. So in terms of somebody who if you're looking at somebody who could be a backup this year with starting experience, Nelson has that. He started 4 games at South Carolina in the nickel spot. So plays a similar position as Jahad Carter, but the difference for him is that he has more eligibility left. So if you're thinking maybe long-term development, maybe he's the backup this year behind Jordan Hancock with some versatility to help fill some spots behind either Lathan Ramson or Caleb Downs when they come off the field or rotate. And they're going to need to rotate because it's going to be a longer season. But you figure he's a depth piece, but also a piece where, look, next year Jordan Hancock's a senior, he'll leave. Lathan Ramson's a senior, he'll leave. So in 2025, he's somebody who could be in the picture as well. Jahad Carter was going to be a super senior this fall, so that's an advantage to bring in somebody like Keenan Nelson Jr.
Right. So it is now kind of the lull before the storm in a couple months. We'll still be back periodically as warranted, but I think for now we'll lay a little low.
Yeah, I think that we'll have some updates if there are any more transfer portal activity or obviously any other news around Ohio State football. Thanks for joining us on our latest edition of the BuckeyeXtra Football Podcast. I'm Joey Kaufman, that was Bill Rabinowitz, and we'll be back for our next episode soon enough. Thanks for listening.
Be sure and subscribe to the BuckeyeXtra podcast in the iTunes Store, the Google Play Store, or on Stitcher.
Just going to run this dog to see if we can find any type of human remains that are left.
Listen to Where Secrets Go to Die, The Disappearance of Derek Hennigan. From the Detroit Free Press, a new podcast set in the woods of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Available on Apple, Spotify, Freep.com, or wherever you get your podcasts.